podcast from Peach 2020, hosted by Peter Martin.
Hello, I'm Peter Martin, founder of Peach 2020, the international network for senior executives, entrepreneurs and influencers from across the hospitality sector. And welcome to our series of Startup Hub podcasts, which see me in conversation with some of the up-and-coming stars in the out-of-home food and drink market, the creators of some of the best new restaurant and bar concepts, the entrepreneurs driving the market forward, and the mentors and investors supporting them and their ambitions, picking up on the issues they face as they grow. These Startup Hub podcasts are sponsored by international law firm Bird & Bird and hospitality tech specialist Zonal. My guest today is someone who has not only launched a new business, but one designed to help others launch and develop their own businesses too. Sessions at Shelter Hall on Brighton seafront opened just pre-pandemic, a next-generation food hall and cultural hub offering home for local food producers and entertainment concepts, or to quote its website, a place where food brands create, test, develop, grow and shine. At the start of this year, the business announced it had raised $7.5 million towards its own expansion plans, including opening 2 more food halls in 2022 and 500 kitchens that will be a mix of delivery-only and dine-in venues run with its restaurant and catering partners. A Sessions studio will also launch, designed to pair aspiring founders with culinary support. But more of that in a minute. Let me first introduce the person behind this ambitious venture, my Startup Hub podcast guest, the Managing Director of Sessions, Dan Warne. Welcome to Startup Hub. So Dan, tell us about Sessions Market. Where did the idea come from? What is the idea? How are you working?
Well, firstly, Peter, thanks a lot for having me on the podcast. And very grateful to see you again. It's been a while, probably a few years. But,
it has indeed.
It's been an interesting few years, to say the least. So
yes.
Much for us to catch up on. So where did the inspiration for Sessions come from? So just for your listeners, my background is I was the MD of Deliveroo for a few years. So I joined there in 2014 and was very grateful to be part of that journey.
And I think we all have heard of Deliveroo, yeah.
I think at this point, at the beginning, it was rather different. And we were doing a lot of door knocking on restaurants who certainly hadn't heard of us back in 2014. But times change. And obviously that was a business that had quite a bit of success. And a lot of that success came through the technology it deployed, which is where I have a lot more experience. I have less experience as an operator. So Sessions, very much my first foray into the world of actually operating restaurants. But the idea for that, and before I get to the idea, I guess I should probably explain what it is that Sessions does. So Sessions is best described as a kind of record label for food talent. So the idea is we have our scouts out in the market trying to assess what the hot new concepts or hot new, let's call them artists, so chefs or food creators might look like. And then we have a studio set up that helps those artists produce brands, which we think will work really well in dynamic food environments. And those dynamic environments are typically food halls or food pop-ups, food markets, areas where consumers can discover new things that perhaps are not yet commoditized, they're not mass-produced. So we start with that, and then through our network of food halls, we begin to build up the brands and develop the relationship with the consumer. And then after that, we try to help the brands scale using underutilized kitchen capacity that might exist elsewhere in the sector. So take the hotel industry. For obvious reasons over the last couple of years, it hasn't been at full occupancy, yet typically they might have large kitchens in big urban areas that potentially can be leveraged for brands that they then use to open up the delivery segment, which is not something hotels would typically open up. So Sessions really is a a platform that tries to bring together both the production of amazing brands and content with then the breathing life into them through the physical site, and then finally the licensing through a big network to give them scale overnight.
But obviously the first physical space you've got is in Brighton. How important is that do all your brands come into that environment?
That's really, really important to us. So I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar that over lockdown, there was something of a trend towards companies or individuals creating virtual brands. So brands that were purely living in the dark kitchens of this world and on delivery platforms, but brands that didn't necessarily have any kind of traditional bricks and mortar or any face-to-face interaction with the consumer. And my view of that, and you're speaking to someone that comes from the delivery world that obviously helped build a platform like Deliveroo, is that it's very, very difficult to develop a relationship with that customer if your brand is purely online. And I would suggest that that's the case in any sector, particularly when a brand is in its earliest stage, so at the beginning of its life cycle. And I think that's probably more true than ever. So if you look at the high street, and this, I suppose, was part of the inspiration for Sessions in the first place, the high street is suffering not because of Amazon or e-commerce platforms. It's suffering because consumer habits have changed. And in the physical world, I believe customers are looking for a more exploratory discovery experience. They want to see new things. They want to learn about what's coming through. Whereas in the digital world, they tend to prefer things that are more familiar. And I saw this at Deliveroo. So established restaurant chains like Wagamama or Nando's do exceptionally well on delivery platforms. But perhaps in the physical world, increasingly, it's clear that customers are looking for something perhaps slightly different, slightly earlier in the life cycle that they can learn about, engage with founder stories, and perhaps immerse themselves in a way that with a slightly more commoditized brand, be it a great brand, but one that's better known, there isn't perhaps that opportunity to gain that level of experience. And so Sessions tries to create a thread through that life cycle. So start the brand from scratch, give it that heartbeat in a physical environment. And that's what we have that you referenced down in Brighton, which is a food hall called Shelter Hall. It has 7 different kitchens in there for 7 different brands to start out. And that's something of an incubator. So it gives them a chance to develop that customer relationship. It gives us a chance to assess whether they're hitting the right metrics, they're establishing that rapport in the way we like to see it. And then from there, if we think a brand is a winner, and we digitalize the whole site as well. So we see all of the metrics that we would see were we running an e-commerce platform, which is also quite interesting. From there, we then assess the winners and we'll invest in those brands to grow overnight across a number of different locations, which is what we call our accelerator program, which is the licensing bit that I just touched on.
So in terms of, let's go through the journey. What's your relationship? You're finding these entrepreneurs, these new ideas, these food producers, pop-ups, whatever they are. You're identifying those, and what is your relationship with them, and what do you offer them apart from that physical space?
Yeah, probably easiest for me to walk you through a real example of that to bring it to life. So when we initiated the food hall in Brighton, which was actually between the 2 lockdowns, so it was actually after the pandemic had started, so I couldn't have timed that much worse, to be honest. But anyway, we got that live in the summer of 2020. Obviously, at that time, there were quite a few local businesses in Brighton that had suffered for the first few months of the pandemic. Yet many of them had really strong social media followings already in the local community. It was very obvious that they'd done a really nice job of developing their brand in their own right. And so one of those was a brand called Lost Boys Chicken. But Lost Boys at that time was running as a concession in a popular pub in Brighton. So they didn't have any bricks and mortar high street presence at that point. Yet they did have this following, so a kind of ready-made audience they'd established. So we went down to the pub and met the founder, tried the food. And firstly, the food was outstanding. Obviously, the food's got to be great for us to work with them. But secondarily, and perhaps to some degree, almost as importantly, the founder was full of charisma and was somebody with a really great story. So his brand was built off the back of supporting people with mental health issues, which we really liked. And we felt was something that our potential customers, at this point we hadn't launched the food yet, but our potential customers would really respond well to and engage with. So we agreed with Tom Samandi, the founder, that when we launched the food hall that summer, we would allocate a kitchen for him and we would make it really easy for him to launch. We would put in all of the CapEx for the kitchen. We'd establish all of the marketing activations for the site. We would run all of the front of house labor. We would provide the POS terminal. We would do everything other than buy the food, cook the food, and produce the great experience for the consumer that we knew, having tasted it ourselves, he'd be able to provide. And so that was great. That's, I suppose, the starting point for him. And it gave him a bigger stage, if you like, than running a concession in a pub. It was a step up from what he'd been doing. And in that environment, it gave us an opportunity to give him a little bit more support, not just the venue itself and the footfall we drove, but also a conversation about, have you thought about how to scale the brand beyond this? What's your aspiration? Where would you like to go with it? And it was clear that Tom was not only a charismatic operator with a great brand, but also had real ambition for it. He wanted to scale it. He wanted to find a way to put it in more people's households than perhaps merely being in Brighton could afford him. And he also wanted to run his own physical bricks and mortar site in Brighton. So we had that chat, and off the back of that, we thought, well, hopefully, if we can give you some longevity within the food hall, you're doing some really big numbers, you're throwing off a decent profit margin, so you can use that to start to contribute to your aspiration to run your own site. But simultaneously, your metrics are so good at Shelter Hall, you've done such a good job with engaging customers and driving top line, that we feel we should take a stab at building out a playbook for your brand that we can license out to other operators, high quality operators, that might be interested in using your brand to engage their local market for delivery. And so we struck a deal with a reputable pub group in Brighton called Lane, that I'm sure you're very familiar with.
I know them well.
And Lane have a number of London sites. And so we agreed with Lane, well, customers, they love your food on site, they love your drinks on site, but they're probably not going to order that kind of food when they're at home. But you've got a great ops team, you've got a kitchen that's ready for not just serving people on a Friday night, but potentially serving people at home as well. And so we brought that brand to them. We worked with Tom to train up their chefs. And within about 9 months, we'd rolled out Lost Boys to over 40 locations across the country, not just with Lane, but other high quality operators that cook that food and then serve Lost Boys to the local community.
Yeah. So in terms of you, I mean, where do you get your financial return on this? Do you take a stake in the business? Do you get a license fee? I mean, how does that work? That financial relationship you've got with people, particularly obviously as they grow, you've invested certainly time and expertise.
Yeah. So the physical model is quite straightforward to understand. It's just like a pub, really. I mean, we run the wet sales and we find partners to come in and run the food. So, think of it as a very large pub that probably has a slightly broader food offering than most pubs might have. We charge a commission to the traders on site, but it's no more than we think is sustainable for them and helps us to to make ends meet on the rent payments and everything else. The model for what we call our accelerator program is a little bit more nuanced. So we charge a fee to the hotel or the pub, which covers the Deliveroo fees that we pay, plus a 5% licensing fee that we pay out to our brand partners. So they make that 5% without having to operate, which when you're quite an early stage brand can be really cash generative for you. And I suppose the end of the story with Lost Boys is that they're now taking a physical site, which has been enabled by the cash they've generated from that program, which is quite a nice thing to convey to new prospective partners as we bring them in. Your core question about, I suppose, an incubator or VC style relationship with the brands. Up until now, we haven't done a huge amount of that, but now we've built our studio. The idea is we will do more of that. So Lost Boys was a brand that already existed on the market. We're now looking to work with individuals who may well have that audience, but haven't got a brand. We will build the brand for them in collaboration with them. And in return for that, we take a split of the equity in that new concept. So, for example, there's a whole new world of social media influencers out there creating food concepts, or food recipes or videos, etc., online that you can't touch and feel in the physical world yet. And we believe that the next big wave coming into the high street will be the bridge between that on social media platforms and how an operator like us can actually bring that to life for them. So we're looking at that as the next phase, I suppose.
Now, looking at Shelter Hall itself, I mean, you talked about providing marketing expertise for the brands who are in there, but how important is that marketing and building Shelter Hall and Sessions as a brand for the consumer as well? How do you balance those? Because obviously you need people coming through the door. One, because you're obviously running the bars, but also to put those as you were clients' food in front of the public.
Yeah, it's a really hard challenge. I suppose the best way of answering that question is to say that we try to build the business in segments, product by product, rather than trying to solve for the end game of an incubator model, throwing off lots of great new brands into the market, which is quite a hard kind of end goal to break down. So instead we say, okay, we have a food hall business. Let's ensure that food hall business works in its own right, independent of the brand building business and the accelerator business. So firstly, we've got a site in Brighton. To make that site in Brighton hum, for it to be valuable, both from a cash flow standpoint and also strategically for the rest of the business, let's understand the Brighton market, let's understand what they want, and let's produce a brand in Shelter Hall that they're going to engage with and get excited about. So version one of this business for Sessions was forget Sessions as a consumer-facing brand. Let's create a brand that's local, that's engaged specifically with the Brighton market, and let's make that work for us. Because if we can't do that, we don't have any other business. So get that bit right. And so Shelter Hall, if you go there, there's no reference to Sessions at all. You wouldn't know that we have anything to do with Shelter Hall. Shelter Hall V1 might be different to Shelter Hall V3. We might start to introduce the Sessions brand slowly to the consumer and begin to create a brand in Sessions that becomes synonymous with quality, I suppose, but synonymous, perhaps more importantly, with something of a movement towards a new wave of restaurant brands coming through and perhaps greater democratization of the sector. That's an overused kind of tech word, but allowing for the new shoots of new stuff to come through is essentially what we're trying to be as a brand. But I'm not trying to do everything all at once. Otherwise, we'll run out of capital very quickly and we won't nail anything. It's important to us to get the things right that we do. Each product we launch, we want to do it really well. And Shelter Hall has been great. We were voted number one in Time Out restaurant in Brighton in our first full year of trading. And we're attracting now a very loyal local customer base. And so then you've got something to work with strategically.
Yeah. So how did you get, let's go back to you and the core business. How do you get Shelter Hall, as it were, off the ground? In a sense, you were launching two things at once. You've got Sessions, which is obviously the incubator, and you've got the physical property of Shelter Hall. So when you were going out to set up that business, how did you go about that? And in terms of getting investment to get that idea off the ground, let alone help other people get themselves off the ground?
Yeah, well, not an easy thing. I suppose the first thing I did was identify the things that I didn't know and didn't have experience in. And as I said at the beginning of the chat, the actual running of hospitality venues, how to identify the right ones, how to appraise the right ones, how to then do the build out, design, how to ensure that the right team was in place from the beginning, how to get the right relationships with suppliers, all of that stuff that for many of the people that will listen to this, they will understand like the back of their hand. I had never done before. So it was important to me to get investors that understood that world much better than me. And so I, towards the end of my time at Deliveroo, started conversing with hospitality investors that understood that world really well. And one of them that's very well known in hospitality, in Bieber, very fortunately for me, thought that the concept was really interesting, really different. I think for them, they are experts in a certain kind of business, and Sessions meant they could give us the benefit of their wisdom there, but also we had some other angles that were quite different for them, which they wanted to explore as well, that would maybe see us represent a slightly different type of entity in the portfolio. And so, that was a great starting point for me because they have, an ops director on the team in Andrew Stones, who's super knowledgeable. They've got property director Kieran Sherlock, like guys that could come in and really help us identify the first site. And Kieran, he's a Brighton local, so he knew the site of Shelter Hall really well. He knew the Brighton market really well. I got very lucky in that at Deliveroo, I came to know the chair of the Restaurant Association in Brighton, someone called Olivia Reed. And so I had a chat with her and asked her to come and join me on this and lead on the food side and make sure we got the right brands in and the right operation on the ground there. And then I was fortunate to get paired, and it was Bieber that helped me find him, with a partner on this, a guy called Ian Banks, who'd been a CFO at Soho House and had done a number of initiatives. He was actually working with Bieber as CFO of Cam and Hooper. So someone that's hospitality through and through. And, that for me gave me, I suppose, a bit of breadth to think through the more holistic model, while I had the right people around me to put the team in place to smash out Shelter Hall. So that was it. I got a bit lucky. Surround yourself with the people that fill the gaps you don't have.
Well, that's a good lesson, isn't it? Get that wraparound. But going back to your time at Deliveroo, because people forget, I suppose. It's still a relatively young company. It's phenomenal growth. But going back to those early days, what did you learn? What are the lessons you learned of that experience of actually creating something very new in delivery and creating Deliveroo? What did you bring in particular into your new venture?
A few things. I think one is the level of ambition that gets instilled in you when you've worked in a business like that is hard to teach. That I certainly didn't have going into Deliveroo. I'd spent 5 years in the US. I built a fairly big business with the team over there, but it wasn't at the same pace that we moved at Deliveroo. And I suppose what was quite striking there is we'd have a fabulous year and do a big round of funding, but immediately we were talking about the next round of funding and how the market would change and how we needed to get ahead of it. And the relentlessness of it propelled us quite quickly in a way that I think surprised all of us. Whether it was me as running the domestic market, or even Will himself, I think would say for him, he never expected it to get as big as it did, and that he'd be one day running a public company and growing at the rate it still is even now. So that ambition, I think, I find now I'm doing my own thing is just really helpful. You're always trying to think bigger, and you're challenging things that you maybe in an older life might have just assumed weren't possible. It's a bit of a cliche to say this, but I suppose you're taught relentlessly to never assume, never because you have a wealth of experience somewhere else that's told you can't do something, allow that to stop you from letting someone else do something. And we have that ethos at sessions where if we sit around a table and someone comes up with an idea and someone says that'll never work because this, and then references something from 5 years ago, that's like a big no-no for us. Like we want people to kind of reinstate a new view of the world. So that's important. I think maybe on the other side, we had amazing camaraderie in the company and a great kind of social culture at Deliveroo, which is something really important, I think, for any business, and clearly in hospitality, that's a part of many people in hospitality's reason for being in hospitality. But I think the relentlessness I referenced before sometimes, pretty exhausting. Don't get me wrong, for anyone doing that. And I've tried this time around to be a bit smarter in how I work. I'd be always busy, always in meetings at Deliveroo where I just wasn't very efficient a lot of the time. And I think with a bit more experience, you realize actually you can be somewhat more ruthless, prioritize better, go pick 3 or 4 areas. I say this with a business that has a lot of different areas to go after, but I've learned a lot of hard lessons too. But great to be part of a journey like that. It gives you a level of kind of endemic confidence that there's no way I would have had otherwise.
But you're going to need that confidence because you're just about to make the business even more complicated, or certainly bigger. Because as I said in the introduction, you've just taken on a lot more investment. You're ambitious, opening a couple more food halls. What can you tell us about that? I mean, where are you looking? Are they going to be replicas? And dare I say, because obviously, food halls aren't unique. I mean, there's some great players in the market. I mean, some have gone by the wayside. I mean, we've got Curb in London, there's Box Park, there's Digbus in the Midlands, obviously the guys at Altrincham Market. So, you're very much on trend, but what's your ambition? What's going to set you apart as you grow, and where are you going to grow?
I think, firstly, worth saying credit to the guys that came first in the food hall space. That certainly wasn't me. So, Roger at Box Park or Curb have been doing the incubation of brands and developing early founders for a long time as well. So I suppose I should say, in terms of differentiation, we don't plan to differentiate hugely in the food halls themselves other than the quality of the brands we're putting in. The differentiation of the business is in trying to create a platform that you plug the products in, and each of them is greater than the sum of the parts by having the synergies with the connected businesses, if you see what I mean. So there's nobody doing all of the things we're doing, but there are lots of people doing each of the things we're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Certainly doesn't mean we don't want to have great food halls that are as good or maybe even better than some of our competitors. But funnily enough, it also means we're more than happy to collaborate with competitors by working with them with our brands, which we also do, I should stress. So our brands, we partner with other food halls to put those brands in.
Yeah, I was going to ask that earlier. So if you're developing a brand, if there's an opportunity to go into a Curb or whatever, that's fine because you're helping those brands.
Absolutely. That's not a concern for us. In fact, we think that's the way forward in the future. And to your question on food halls, we do want to continue to build food halls. We think that there are certain regions that are particularly interesting that food halls allow us a kind of landmark position in to really help build our brand and brands plural out in those areas. But the long game is probably not to have 100 food halls across the market. I think we see them as the Apple store of our model rather than necessarily the way that will generate the majority of our cash. And I think that's why the round that we've just done from a financing standpoint has come more from a VC than perhaps the original PE type investor that we took at the beginning, who was, Bieber, incredibly important, but nevertheless a more traditional investor when it comes to the type of returns that they expect to make. So more regional sites to give us that hub in those core areas. We are entertaining whether there might be an opportunity for something smaller format that's a bit more scalable, that allows us perhaps a route to doing more sites than I currently have in the plan. And obviously there are opportunities up and down the high street at the moment for smaller markets where something like this, I think, could play a key role in helping to regenerate urban areas. But, ultimately, in the end, ideally, we end up with some, and this is all theoretical, right? But amazing IP, a great tech platform, and then everyone else operates. That would be a beautiful thing. But, that's a hard place to get to.
Oh, you see the end game, yeah. But can you tell us where you're looking for these new halls yet, or is that still in the pipeline?
I think we want to find sites in London. We recognise the importance of London, both from a strategic standpoint in the raw volume of people that will go past the brands that you're trying to develop equity within. Also, as we build the business and we seek further investment down the line, being there, being front and centre for investors is quite important. We also think London certain areas of London represent quite a big opportunity right now. Other than London, the South Coast, we have an amazing food hall in Bournemouth that, fingers crossed, we can move forward with later this year. So we know what it is to launch a food hall on the seafront, what it is to have a mix of a local and a transient population, and how to engage both and how to deal with the kind of peaks and troughs that you get with that operationally. So we think Bournemouth fits the bill on that, and it's a really exciting emerging market, big tourist trade, and a lot of people moving there now that people are increasingly working from home. Other than that, on the food hall side, we have looked at opportunities north of Watford, but we're yet to decide precisely where we want to go. We kind of want to develop further our expertise in areas where geographically we at least know the locale before overextending ourselves. Yeah.
Now, finally, in terms of that mix of business, because obviously what's really important, and certainly with your background, is the delivery side as well, because part of that plan, and you talked about that, is developing kitchens or utilizing underused kitchens elsewhere. How do you see that mix of business for the brands you're working with between selling out of the physical space, and you mentioned how important that is, but in terms of just volume of trade, how much do you think is going to come through delivery?
So within our 5-year plan, about 80% of our trade comes through delivery in the end. But if you think of the program of how this is designed to work, whether it does or not remains to be seen. It's create brand in the studio, goes into the food hall environment to breathe life into it and to make sure it works. So let's say that's 6 months, maybe a year. Then once people are more familiar with it and it's tried and tested, then license it out and scale it across kitchens up and down the country. You, in the earlier stages of our life cycle, have a business that does much more trade in the physical sites, the discovery point in the life cycle. And then gradually, as you put more and more brands in the hopper and more of them come out of that early stage, more go into delivery, and the delivery side of the business becomes bigger and bigger. Probably in line with how any brand has seen delivery become bigger as they get later in their life cycle. So a Wagamama's or a Nando's has a huge amount of their trade coming out of that, because on delivery platforms, people love familiar brands in a way that in a food hall, you actually don't want something familiar. You want something you haven't seen before. It's just a bit different.
Yeah, that's a discovery area. Yeah. Well, Dan Warne, thank you very much. We've covered a lot of ground there, and thank you for sharing your vision of the future for sessions and, dare I say it, the market. So an inspirational half hour. Thank you very much. And I'll be down to Brighton as soon as I can. See you soon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter.
This series of podcasts is sponsored by Bird & Bird and Zonal. The Peach Podcast is always free to listen to. And to find us, search Peach 2020, the Startup Hub, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or in any app that supports podcasts. And all of our podcasts will be uploaded to our YouTube channel too. Now, don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes.
Podcast from Peach 2020, hosted by Peter Martin.